Hi, I'm Anil Agarwal, VP Executive Compensation at American Express. Today we have Mike Halloran from Mercer to talk about use of relative TSR as a performance measure under long-term incentive program. Mike, welcome.
Thank you.
Mike, as you know, companies struggle. Goal setting under long-term incentive plan is a challenge. Companies with all the right intentions kind of struggle with it. And one solution to that is use some kind of relative TSR performance. From your experience point of view, what are some of the benefits of using relative TSR under a performance plan?
Well, the benefits, I'd say, are several. One is that the situation where you don't have to set long-term goals, so you're measuring against a benchmark, thus it does self-correcting or self-counting, is a very big plus. It's very hard in today's world to set three-year goals. The world changes rapidly, so that's certainly one way to go. Second benefit is that it's completely aligned with how many people view shareholders' results. So effectively, if you've done well for shareholders, it's going to show on a relative basis. If you've done poorly, it's going to show as well. So again, if the name of the game for many in this business tends to be how well has the company performed for shareholders, that metric clearly captures that. So I'd say those are probably the two biggest benefits. Third is perhaps it's fairly widely accepted. You know, probably a good half of companies that have long-term performance plans have relative TSR as at least a piece of the program. So again, it's a fairly recognized metric and well understood by many.
So from the other side of the coin point of view, Mike, what are some of the watch outs? So if a company is considering use of relative TSR, what are some of the cons or things you would like them to consider before adopting it?
Sure. Cons are several. One is that if you want to give some line of sight to your management team saying, here's how we want you to perform over the next 3 years, you're not going to get that with relative TSR. This is the metric that gives you the answer at the end, but you really can't walk into the room and say, here's what we need to do to drive TSR. So from that perspective, for those that believe we've got a strategic plan, we have 2 or 3 key metrics we want to drive, you're not going to be attaching the incentive plan to those key metrics, you're attaching the incentive plan to the outcome or the result of that. So that's probably one big disadvantage. Second thing is, from a participant, you really don't know the answer to the end. You could be doing very well through 6 months, a year and a half, but again, you don't really know because you don't know how others are doing in this peer group that you're being compared to. And third, perhaps, is even finding a fair peer group to compare the team to. Unless you use a broad index, and there are weaknesses with that, many companies in today's world are in industries that have consolidated quite a bit, and it's hard to find a group of 10 to 15 companies that are just like you that you think it's fair to, let's say, judge the management team's performance against using relative TSR.
So Mike, you kind of started answering my next question. So it seems like from the minimum number of peers point of view, you think you need at least 10 to 15. Is there a kind of a magical number that don't go below that? And kind of similar question, from your experience point of view, what is your advice? What is the right peer group? Is it the same as the compensation peer group, or is it different? Is one index better than others? How should a company go about evaluating what is the right peer group?
Very good question. People spend a lot of time on those questions. So number one, let's talk about what's the right number in the peer group. I think ideally, many would say having something in the middle teens at least allows for some M&A activity over the 3-year period, so that if you lose a couple companies because they've been acquired, you still have a decent group of 10 plus at the end of the day to compare yourselves against. Most industries don't have 25 or 30 that you can really pick from, so if you get something in the teens, that's pretty good. Now, that having been said, some industries have just 4 or 5 key players, and there are a few industries, large oil companies for one, where they really have 4 or 5 peers. And many of them use a peer group of 4 or 5, saying the investor world is judging us on how we do against this small group of companies, and we're going to measure ourselves that way. But that would be the exception, not the rule. The second part of the question is, are the peers for relative TSR the same as you might use for compensation benchmarking? On that point, people have different perspectives. If you say the reason for the compensation benchmarking peer group is to identify what's the pay market for talent, oftentimes that's broader than just the group you might consider as direct business peers. So if you feel that way, you may find that you do have one group for compensation benchmarking and a separate group that's used for either comparing your business performance or how investors tend to view the company.
Now, Mike, I've seen kind of 2 flavors of relative TSR. The terminology I use is, one is rack and stack, where you are ranking companies 1 to 20, let's say. Another is more of market-weighted cap index point of view. Can you talk a little bit about that benefit of one versus another?
The rack and stack is one that's probably more common and certainly executives can understand. You see the list of companies, you see where you fit at the end of the day, and you kind of nod your head and say that makes sense. The flip side is if you're in an industry where you've got several very big companies, several very small companies, the issue of perhaps weighting the companies by their market value or the like has a lot of merit, given that moving a big ship might be worth a whole lot more value from a performance standpoint than moving a very small ship real fast. So I think if you have that situation where a very diverse set of peers, both size and value, you might move to the approach of maybe weighting by market cap, but beyond that, if they're not too dissimilar, the rack and stack is something that most people will relate to pretty well.
One experience I have with these programs is the roller coaster ride. Generally, as you know, most programs pay more or less around the target. Right. With TSR program, because it's difficult to consistently beat the market or even match the market, so some companies have the experience where you have a period of no payout, followed by a period of maximum payout, and again followed by closer to minimum payout, as opposed to a consistent, more or less, towards the target payout. Is that what you have experienced? Or any comment or feedback on that?
For the most part, many would tell you, and based on observations, that steady performing companies, the ones you probably would prefer to be associated with, will rarely be at the very top of a group. They tend to be in the middle. The flip side is that the star performer today, from a TSR standpoint, probably was in a lot of trouble 3 years ago. So if you're a good performing company, the odds of maxing out are not that great, but the odds of not getting anything are also not that great. So I think that if you're a company who has struggled or has rebounded, you're going to be seeing peaks and valleys. A steady company is going to be receiving payments, all likelihood, somewhere around target, plus or minus. And I think in the scheme of things, many would say that from managing the senior team and even all participants for that matter, steady, consistent results are probably a better way to go if you can get there.
Okay. And Mike, have you seen any tweaks to the program based on companies' experiences? For example, in case of relative TSR, if the returns are negative, a company may be ranked higher, highly, but they may have a negative TSR, or TSR may be in low tier, kind of single-digit number. Are companies doing anything to address that kind of absolute performance?
There are a few. Until probably the financial crisis of 08-09, hardly anyone envisioned the fact that the whole group could be negative. And when that happened, some people said, we might be paying maximum in a case where our return is negative. Is that fair to shareholders? Now, the flip side is, of course, stock price is probably way down, so the payout was probably not that strong. But some companies have moved philosophically to say that if our TSR isn't positive, no matter where we rank, the most we can get is target, or perhaps we will reduce the payout by X% just to reflect that. The flip side of the coin, and the majority is still there, are the mindset that if you're still the highest in a negative situation, you must have done something better than others, and the team should be rewarded for that. Again, recognizing if it's negative, where you started in terms of the award values are clearly lower than what you intended them to start with.
My final question is a little bit technical. From the Monte Carlo valuation point of view, I think the value it gives you from accounting point of view, and that ultimately shows up under the summary comp table, is higher than the granted target value. So if a CEO got a grant of, let's say, $100,000, my experience was that Monte Carlo value was about $110,000 or $120,000. Have you kind of run into that issues, and if yes, how are companies addressing that?
I would say on average the Monte Carlo values, which is the accounting value as you mentioned, tends to be between probably 80% and 120% of the stock price of the date of grant. And the reason it gets there is a very complicated reason, but that's the accounting value you need to use. So then you've got the second question of, when I give you the number of shares that you would be expected to receive, what am I dividing it by? I would say most have gravitated towards using the stock price at the date of grant rather than the Monte Carlo value, because the accounting value is there for a reason that many don't understand, and communicating it to the executive team, unless it happens to be below 100%, generally is a tough thing to do. So I'd say most have taken that tack, but some feel alignment with accounting values and what goes in the summary comp tables should all tie together. If you believe that very strongly, then you're going to use the Monte Carlo value, and if you do that, you're going to have some periods when you're going to be giving people fewer shares than they think they might be entitled to.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you very much for your time today. For Word at Work TV, I'm Anil Agarwal.